The mother of all talk shows is back. Unleashed, unabridged, uncensored, and unbelievable. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the Airwaves, the College of Knowledge, where there are absolutely no tuition fees and you're positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher. That'll be me. Well, they're off and running in the mother of all British general elections. All bets are off, given the failure of Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson to negotiate a non-aggression pact. Anything can happen. We'll be talking to the king of British psephologists, Professor Sir John Curtice, about the runners and riders and the early form in the first furlong of what is going to be a long race. And on the day that the Labour leadership accuses the Tory leadership of effectively maybe being secret Russian agents, we'll be talking to one of the authors of a brand new spellbinding book about the comrades in arms, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. And we'll be looking at the disaster that Libya has become. So fasten up your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride because this is rock and roll radio with pictures.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
This is London, but coming to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet. On SputnikNews.com, you can listen to us all over the world. You can, of course, also watch us. And that's the difference in this rock and roll radio show. You can watch us on Facebook, on multiple platforms, on YouTube, on multiple platforms, even on Twitter. Our audience figure grew last week by almost 10% on the previous week. And the previous week's audience was 15% higher than the week before. So that's a 25% increase in the audience over 2 weeks. Over 500,000 of you are now watching or listening to all or part of this show, and from every part of the world. You can listen, of course, on FM if you are in the Washington, D.C. area. 105.5 is the magic number there. If you're watching on Facebook, please share it with all of your friends on Facebook, because, as you know, I'm rather keen to reach the 1 million mark so far as our global audience is concerned. Now, the mother of all general elections in Britain has begun. It looked as if it was going to be a procession. There would be some kind of non-aggression pact between the Brexit party, led by Nigel Farage, without whom there would have been no Brexit, no referendum, and British politics would be a very different, more somnolent place over the last few years. It looked even possible that they might reach an electoral pact, with the Brexit party standing against Labour mainly in the Midlands and the North, and in South Wales, with the Conservatives concentrating on the wealthier parts of Britain, which is, of course, the parts they know best. But that has all fallen through. Moreover, Jeremy Corbyn has been out the traps like a thoroughbred racehorse. And that should come as no surprise, because that's what he did in 2017. They have always, as George W. Bush might put it, misunderestimated Mr. Corbyn, at least as a campaigner. There's no doubt that of all the political leaders in this election, he's the one that can make the ground shake when he visits the towns, cities, and villages across this country. And he's already been in the best part of a dozen places, speaking to enthusiastic crowds already. Boris Johnson's only been out once, and that was to a hospital. Who advised him to do that? I'd like to know. And of course, he was predictably booed and rubbished by the people in the hospital, anxiously waiting for hours to see an A&E nurse or doctor, people who were visiting people in inadequate hospital conditions, doctors and nurses themselves who've had their issues with the Conservative government over these last 9 years. And that is, in a way, the Tories' biggest problem. They've been in for 9 years, and things certainly aren't good in Britain. So far as our economy is concerned, our society is concerned, levels of crime on our streets are concerned. None of these are success stories for the Conservatives. Now, Boris Johnson is a new leader, and he would have hoped, might yet be able to convince people that, well, all that went before was the fault of David Cameron, George Osborne, Theresa May, Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as was, and all the others, that this is a new Tory party, a new Tory party leader. And he may, of course, succeed in doing that. There's a long way to go. But there's no doubt also that the new circumstances, with the Liberal Democrat vote plummeting in the opinion polls, that the pro-EU camp, in which, unfortunately, I must include Labour, despite the labyrinthine nuance of their position, and that's putting it very kindly, if that camp unites behind Labour and the Brexit camp is divided, then Boris Johnson may very well be in for a shock. And Jeremy Corbyn's policy programme is much more attractive to people in working class areas, middle class areas, than the Conservatives' programme is likely to be. In short, in my view, if Boris Johnson can keep the prevailing narrative to Brexit, where he has at least tried to deliver the result of the Brexit referendum of 2016, then Boris Johnson will be the next Prime Minister. If, on the other hand, Jeremy Corbyn succeeds in changing the election narrative to the bread and butter economic and social policies where he is on his strongest ground, then it is indeed possible that Jeremy Corbyn could emerge, probably not as the leader of a majority Labour government, maybe not even as the leader at all, but that Labour could emerge as part of an anti-Brexit hung parliament. I make that immediate penultimate caveat, if you like, because I'm here to tell you exactly as I predicted 100 times on the mother of all shows, mother of all talk shows. You can look it up, you can consult the record. 100 times I told you this. No one will be deselected. Not one Labour MP will be deselected. I said I was going out on a limb because there were some people, Wes Streeting, Dame Hodge, Jess Phillips, and so on, that you would have thought would surely be deselected. But I went out on that limb. And guess what, folks? I've been proven 100% right. Not a single Labour MP has been deselected, except Chris Williamson, who's actually the most pro-Corbyn, pro-Labour, most socialist MP in the House of Commons, the only man to stand up for Julian Assange, the only man to stand up for Venezuela and so on. Well, he's suspended and we'll know on Wednesday if he's going to be ruled out as a parliamentary candidate. But not one person has been deselected, which means if Labour returns all of its current MPs, then it's exactly the same Parliamentary Labour Party that has spent the last 4 years and more trying to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. So it may very well be that Corbyn could emerge as the largest party in the general election and then promptly be deposed by one way or another. We'll be running a poll tonight. I think it's already up. I hope it is. Who do you think will win the British general election? Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, or do you think it will be a hung parliament? So get voting now on that, please. Now, we're talking about many other things also. We're talking on the day that the Labour leaders cast aspersions that the Conservative Party leaders were somehow agents of influence of Russia. Yes, you heard that correctly. Lady Nuggie, Emily Thornberry, the shadow foreign secretary, alleged today that Dominic Cummings, the chief of staff of Boris Johnson, has questions to answer about the time he spent living and working in Russia. You couldn't actually make it up. It's kind of like an absolute volte-face, a reversal of the kind of allegations that are traditionally made. Now, that made me think that this is a good time to talk about this book. It's an absolutely spellbinding read by three very eminent authors, all of them academics, one of them British, one of them Irish, I think, and the other Russian. And it's called Churchill and Stalin, Comrades in Arms during the Second World War. I found the book absolutely fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the author. Because, of course, Britain has a long and tortured record in its relations with Russia. Mr. Churchill himself was the driving force behind a huge British military effort which actually invaded Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, the anniversary of which is coming up very soon. And the purpose of the British military intervention was to bring down the new Bolshevik government in Petrograd and Moscow. And it never really got much better in all the years ever since, except for those years when Churchill was ready, willing, able to join the wartime alliance, form the closest possible relationship with Stalin, present Stalin with King George's personal sword of Stalingrad to commemorate the most decisive battle in the Second World War. Things were going swimmingly. The Cold War needn't have happened. We'll be talking to these authors about all these issues. I don't know if they've got a view on whether Dominic Cummings is actually a comrade of mine after all, whether he's an NKVD officer. We'll find out maybe in the wash. Maybe Emily Thornberry has a scintilla of evidence behind the otherwise rather sinister aspersions which she cast on Cummings today. And we'll be talking about Libya. We'll be talking to a professor, a Canadian professor, Maximillian Forte, who has written a terrific book on the Sarkozy, Cameron, and Clinton-Obama war on Libya, just because it went so catastrophically wrong. There was no reason to believe that it would go better than catastrophically wrong, but a remarkable number of people across the political spectrum seemed all too easily convincible that it would. It wouldn't be another Iraq, they said. There's no Al-Qaeda in Libya, they said. Gaddafi is talking through a hole in his hat when he says, if I fall, I'll be replaced by Al-Qaeda. Well, in a way, Gaddafi was wrong. He's been replaced not by Al-Qaeda alone, but by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and many other fronts of the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism. And Libya is no longer a country at all. It's no longer a state. It has 3 governments, 3 parliaments, 4 prime ministers. Don't ask me to explain the maths on that one. And they're all fighting each other still, like ferrets in a sack, murdering each other, massacring each other, stealing the oil of Libya and selling it for their own warlord purposes. It was arguably even more catastrophic, for Europe at least, than the equally ill-fated attack, assault, and occupation that we participated in over Iraq. Because, of course, Libya is on the Mediterranean. And once we blew the doors off, well, you know what happened next. And you know that one of the consequences of what happened next, the mass outflow of people from Africa, people escaping in boats, many of which capsize, submerge, drown the occupants, has led to the kind of refugee flows which led to the catastrophe in Essex just a couple of weeks ago now, where dozens of people were found dead in a refrigerated lorry in the south of England. And of course, we only take a tiny, tiny percentage of that refugee flow. The politics of Greece, of Italy, of Spain, of Portugal have all been seriously altered by that refugee flow, that mass movement of people across the Mediterranean. We'll be talking, as I said, in just a minute to a man for whom I have the highest respect. He is the doyen of psephologists, of political scientists. There's nothing he doesn't know about elections, about referenda, and about who is likely to come out on top. We'll be talking to Professor Sir John Curtice right after this break.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, don't forget, you're positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher, either in approbation or in a maybe more hostile way. Here's the number, 0207 798 2255. That's 0207 798 2255. If you're in the US, it's 001 757 744 4480. And you can tweet me at George Galloway or at GG Moats or at RTUK, preferably at all three. Now, we've got a poll up already. 700 people or so have voted already. Who will win the British general election 2019? A, Boris Johnson. B, Jeremy Corbyn. C, a hung parliament. I think that probably covers it. Joe Swinson might say I'm being sexist, misogynistic, because I haven't included her. But frankly, I stand by my story. Now, on the line is the king of psephologists, Professor Sir John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde. Once upon a time, I represented that fine establishment in Parliament. Now, I could pay Sir John no higher compliment than cutting short my monologue in order to accommodate him, but I'm told he's not quite there yet. Let me just, as it were, give an overview of the polls today. The Conservatives are either 8 points clear of Labour, 11 points clear of Labour, 12 points clear of Labour, or 16 points clear of Labour in the poll in the Observer this morning. So whatever way you dice it, Boris Johnson is ahead, but not necessarily as well ahead as he would have expected. And the Labour score would appear, at least in one of the polls, to have given the party a bounce. If it's 8% clear, that's definitely too close for comfort, especially if you factor in that Theresa May was 20 points clear of Jeremy Corbyn at the beginning of general election 2017. Corbyn has shown already that he can claw back leads. Now, whether the hydra-headed policy of Labour on Brexit, with some candidates calling themselves the People's Vote candidate, others openly saying that they will renegotiate with the European Union a new Brexit deal and then put it to the country in a referendum, but they will campaign against their own deal, or whether you're staying stum on that point like Corbyn himself is, then if that potential Achilles heel can somehow be shielded, guarded, kept away from the studs of the opposition, I mean football studs, not the other kind of studs. We'll see. Let's talk to the man himself, Professor Sir John Curtice. John, Professor, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Good evening, George.
Let's start with the analysis you've already made. You may want to amend it, I don't know. That this Parliament, the next Parliament, will have more non-Labour and Conservative MPs than any Parliament in the last 100 years. Do you still believe that, John?
Well, 100 is slightly too long a period, but let's just focus on post-war British politics since 1945. Because if you go back 100 years, you're still going back to the era when the Liberal Party was a serious competitor.
Okay.
Yeah, basically the calculus is as follows, is that in Scotland, it looks as though the SNP would at least hang on to their share of the vote, maybe even go up a bit. But meanwhile, one of the things we have to remember is that, indeed, across the UK as a whole, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party are down on where they were in 2017. So even if the SNP simply stands still, given that pretty much every seat in Scotland is marginal, and certainly virtually all the seats that the SNP lost in 2017 are marginal, it seems very likely that the SNP are going to end up with more MPs, and maybe as many as 48 or 50 or so. Then the Liberal Democrats. Well, the Liberal Democrats, admittedly, are down a couple of points in the polls today, so who knows, maybe they'll go down a bit further. But at the moment, at least, 30 or so Liberal Democrat MPs seems a not unreasonable expectation. So that gets us to perhaps the 80 mark or so. 18 from Northern Ireland, guaranteed, because neither Conservative nor Labour fight there, which then add 3 or 4 from Plaid Cymru, Caroline Lucas from the Greens, and it looks as though 100 third-party MPs is perfectly possible, and we've not had that in the post-war era. And the reason why this matters, or even any figure relatively close to it, is that the more third-party MPs there are inside the House of Commons, other things being equal, the more difficult it is for either Conservative or Labour to win an overall majority. And here we should remember the last 3 elections, 2 hung parliaments, one in which the governing party only had a majority of 12 and decided that majority was inadequate within a couple of years. These were not accidents, and the fact that we are now at least have a high probability of there being more third-party MPs just makes it even less likely that we will get anything. We won't necessarily get a hung parliament, but it's not terribly likely at the moment that we're going to get a landslide majority of the kind that we saw in 1983 or 1997.
Now, today's polls, Sir John, there's a big spread. I mean, Johnson's either 16 points ahead, which would point to a very big Conservative majority, notwithstanding what you've just said, or he's 8 points ahead. How do you account for that spread, and what do you think? What does your peerless instinct tell you?
Well, let's first of all cut through the confusion. There have been 7 polls published since the election was effectively called, basically on Thursday when the legislation went through. On average, and 6 of the companies that did those polls also polled in the fortnight or so after the deal was negotiated between Boris Johnson and the EU and before the election was called. So we can compare like with like here. Now, if we do that and take the average of the 7 polls that have come out today and compare it with the ones that were done just before the election, well, basically the Conservatives are now running at 38, up 2, Labour at 27, up 2, Liberal Democrats 16, down 2, Brexit Party 10, down 2. So the key point to take away from the confusion is this. One is that the squeeze on the Brexit Party vote has moved further, such that indeed now, on average, the Conservatives have about 59% of the Leave vote, which is pretty much in line with what Theresa May achieved in 2017. The Conservatives, however, are still weaker amongst those who voted Remain than they were in 2017, and they're also not particularly popular amongst those who didn't vote in the EU referendum. But basically, the Conservative Party is squeezing the Brexit Party further amongst Leavers. But then the other thing that seems to have happened in these polls, and it's consistent across the polls, is that for the first time since the back end of May, it looks as though the Labour Party may finally have edged up a bit, and they've done so at the expense of the Democrats. And if you look at what's happened amongst Remain voters, there's a 3 to 4 point swing amongst Remain voters, and that's clearly action to be watched. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind here, Boris Johnson, of course, can try to squeeze the Brexit Party vote as much as he can, but he'll have no control at all over what happens on the Remain side of the argument. And I don't think the Conservatives will welcome the fact that today the Labour Party are apparently making a bit of progress on the Democrats. Now, yes, there is a spread. The spread actually is not as serious in the polls as it was a few weeks ago when we were having some polls 2 or 3 point Labour lead and others suggesting it was about 15 points. There is an argument going on in the polling industry in particular about the accuracy with which people recall having voted Labour in 2017. And some of the pollsters, such as YouGov, who asked people on their panel of people they regularly interview just after the last election, how they voted, report that if you ask them more recently how they voted, there's a bit of a fall off in the proportion of people who remember having voted Labour. In other words, some people who said they voted Labour 2 years ago have forgotten that they did so, perhaps because they're embarrassed about the fact, or they're certainly not registered on their memory anymore. And therefore, polls which don't have that kind of information, that only simply rely on people who tell you how they voted last time more recently, they're at a disadvantage perhaps in weighting their data accurately, or at least they are if they don't take into account the possibility of recall errors. So that's the debate that's going on. But one has to say, George, although, yes, the absolute numbers do vary a bit, the structure in these polls is very, very similar. They basically show the Conservative Party doing well amongst Leavers. They show the Remain vote split, but today is rather less split than it was. And it's those two facts that you need to understand why Boris Johnson is ahead in the polls.
Implicit in what you say is this. If the election is fought on Brexit, you get one result. But if Jeremy Corbyn can somehow, and there are media outlets that would like to help him do that, change the subject and concentrate more on non-Brexit issues, Labour has much more of a chance. Would you agree?
Well, I think the assumption in your question, George, is the Labour Party has a Brexit policy which it struggles to attract voters on. And I would be inclined to agree with you on that. Certainly the polling evidence suggests that voters, when asked, is the party's policy clear or confusing, whereas voters tend to be reasonably clear where the other three parties stand on Brexit. They do struggle with the Labour Party position. And indeed, if you then give voters a description of the three positions of the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrats and ask them to choose which they most prefer, it's the Labour one that is least popular. So, yes, it may well indeed be the case if the Labour Party is going to make progress in this election, it's going to have to do so by trying to focus people's minds on its non-Brexit policies, where, it does have at least some clear messages. It wants to nationalise a number of our central utilities. It's got ideas about creating a fund for each privately quoted company whereby the employees own some of the share capital and get some of the dividends therefrom. Of course, it certainly wants high taxation. It's still in favour of scrapping university tuition fees in England. And today it's also come up with some fairly radical ideas for improving the insulation of everybody's home. And I wouldn't deny also that some of these policies are at least potentially popular. The difficulty here, of course, is this, twofold. One is the Conservative Party on the domestic agenda is fighting on a very different platform, certainly from 2015 and to some degree from 2017. We have only today had the Conservative Party saying that it is going to now uprate welfare benefits in line with inflation and going to increase pensions more. And more broadly, Boris Johnson seems to have found the magic money tree that Theresa May couldn't discover. And against that backdrop there, what the Labour Party is now finding itself doing is saying, well, the Conservatives might want to spend more than they've been doing, but we're willing to spend even more. In other words, it's a choice between two magic money trees, and that is obviously potentially rather more difficult to sell than a Conservative Party that's still emphasising fiscal rectitude, all of which seems to have gone out of the window, and a Labour Party that says, no, austerity is wrong. And both sides now seem to agree that austerity is wrong. So that's one difficulty. The other potential difficulty, of course, is that, yes, the Labour Party might want to talk about things other than Brexit, but the Conservatives are happy to talk about Brexit. The Liberal Democrats are happy to talk about Brexit. They will want to pin the fact that the withdrawal treaty went through on the second reading at Labour's door because it's 19 Labour MPs that voted for it, and they want to get Remain voters to not to back Labour on those grounds. And of course, the Brexit Party is more than happy to talk about Brexit. So Labour may succeed, but it perhaps may be more difficult for Labour to hold the agenda in the way that they did in 2017, when frankly one of the Conservative Party's problems, very simple. It wasn't just everybody else that was surprised by Theresa May's decision to call a general election. So was the Conservative Party itself, and it frankly wasn't ready for the campaign.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn has shown, I think, in the first week that he hasn't lost his mojo. He's quite a formidable street campaigner. Now, it's also true, though, isn't it, that Boris Johnson is a far more, personable, charismatic candidate than Theresa May was. Do you think that Boris has made a good start? Seemed an odd thing to do to me, to have his one and only outing so far to, of all places, a hospital.
Well, that's because the Conservative Party is wanting to defend itself on the NHS, and given that the polling suggests that actually the Labour leader over the Conservatives on the NHS is perhaps not as large as it is on some occasions, then I think, frankly, the Conservative Party is wanting to defend itself on that position, much as David Cameron, indeed, was quite insistent on campaigning on the NHS a while back. But certainly, I mean,
But he got the bird, John. I mean, he got booed, even if it was only by a few people. That became the story.
Yeah, that always becomes a risk. I mean, I remember Tony Blair being harangued outside hospital in 2001. That almost seems to be par for the course if you decide to step in onto a hospital concourse. But I mean, I think, more broadly, I mean, you're right. I mean, back in 2017, basically Jeremy Corbyn was the only effective campaigner. Theresa May struggled. Tim Farron was rather hapless. And Paul Nuttall, well, nobody knew who Paul Nuttall was. This time, Jeremy Corbyn not only faces the charisma of Boris Johnson, though I grant you it's sometimes a bit of an unguided missile, and his way with words can sometimes get him into trouble, but also Nigel Farage, who's going to be campaigning up and down, and who is one of the other most charismatic politicians in our politics. So against that backdrop, be aware that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't necessarily have the same relative advantage, but I grant you does have the advantage. The one key attribute that he has as a leader is that he is an effective campaigner. He's a relaxed campaigner. I mean, in the 2017 election, as it were, the long election campaign went on, the more one got the feeling from Jeremy Corbyn was, I'm quite enjoying this.
I'm enjoying this, yeah.
And doubtless against that experience, he will start from that backdrop. But I mean, I think, for example, he is going to have to be careful. I mean, for example, he's saying he's wanting to move away from Brexit. Well, one of the reasons why Boris Johnson is where he is in the polls is that he's persuaded Leave voters that the reason why Brexit hasn't happened is because of Jeremy Corbyn. He's pinned that on Corbyn. He seems to have pinned it successfully, much the same way as the Conservatives successfully pinned on the Labour Party, arguably, but not very fairly, the fault for the financial crash of 2008. And Corbyn's failure to respond to that, I think, is dangerous because, it's fairly obvious, and one might want to point out that actually Boris Johnson voted twice against Theresa May's deal, and a central reason why the UK did not leave the European Union on March the 29th is because the Conservative Party, or sections of it, voted against. But the Labour Party, frankly, don't seem to be willing and ready to respond on this. And I think, it is somewhat dangerous because basically you do want to persuade voters that the fact that Boris Johnson failed to leave on October the 31st is an indication that you can't necessarily believe his promises. It seems to me that's what has to be a central line of Labour Party attack, and that in a sense I've got this sense that the Labour Party is at risk of still trying to fight the last campaign to say the Tories are a nasty party that favour big business and are in favour of austerity, whereas I think maybe something more subtle is now required, like a party delivered by a prime minister who overpromises, and who, when you look at some of the details of the Conservative public policy spending, is perhaps public policy spending that is might be thought to be more likely to favour those from more middle-class areas and less socially deprived areas than had been the focus hitherto of much public spending. But it requires the Labour Party to move on and be a bit more subtle, and I'm a little bit concerned that the Labour Party has not grasped the need for that subtlety at this point.
Do you think Nigel Farage has made the right decision not to stand himself? And how many do you think in the end they will end up standing in?
Well, I think that's the first question. Yes, he probably is right. I mean, if he was going to fight, he'd probably have to fight Thanet South, as he did in 2015. He would certainly do well in that neck of the woods, but it does tie him to one corner of the country, and there's no guarantee that he would win. Whereas as a roving leader who is able to support his party up and down the country, and in particular can take the argument to the Conservative Party about the merits of Boris Johnson's deal. And, whatever one thinks of the merits of Nigel Farage's case, I think he very clearly demonstrated on Friday that he can certainly argue a cogent case against Boris Johnson's deal from the perspective of somebody who is an ardent leaver, and he's probably going to find it easier to do that if he's able to go around the country. How many are they going to fight? I suspect that they are going to fight much of the country. They are reported to have a fair amount of money. They're supposed to have 500 candidates selected. Maybe in the end they won't decide to stand against some of the ERGers, but to be honest, not many of the ERGers need Nigel Farage's help. And what he wants to do is to fight a nationwide campaign, which is taking the argument of Boris Johnson. He needs to have candidates everywhere, not least because it will affect how the broadcasters treat the party during the election campaign.
Lastly, Sir John, and I'm grateful for your time as always, it's a December election, almost mid-December.
Yeah.
It'll be cold and dark and wet, and we've never had one since, I think, the first election that Labour, I see, 18-something. So we've
1923 we last had.
And Labour won that. Ramsay MacDonald won that election.
No. The Conservatives won the election, George, but the Liberal Party then put Labour Party in power because the Conservatives were a minority and they lost the Queen's Speech.
So it's almost unprecedented, certainly in the lifetime of anyone listening to this, mid-December nearly, polling. Yeah. What's that going to do to the turnout in your view?
But winter elections, we have had two in the post-war period. One was in February 1974 on the 28th in the wake of the three-day week and the coal miners' strike and the electricity being turned off for hours on end. 79% turnout, up 6 points on the summer of 1970. And the highest ever turnout in a UK election is since the advent of the mass franchise, February 1950, 84%. I think of it like this, George. If we're all willing to go out in December to do Christmas shopping and to go to nativity plays and watch the Christmas light and go to Christmas fairs, we can probably make it to the polling station.
Perfectly put. Professor Sir John Curtice, as always, you're a gentleman and definitely a scholar. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, my poll's doing big numbers, 1,500 votes so far. A, Boris Johnson, 38%. B, Jeremy Corbyn, 35%. C, hung Parliament, 27%. Very, very interesting. A hung Parliament is very likely, says OC24, because of all the outliers in play, Lib Dems, SNP, etc. But the only way we stand a hope in hell of ending this all amicably is with a second referendum. And even then, possibly a third referendum. So I'm backing Corbyn because we need that choice. Another 2 referendums. That'll end it all amicably, I assure you. And the invidious Envy says, I had an odd dream. Will Labour get 323 seats and the Brexit Party get 27 seats? Don't know what others got. And I know some of this might sound like the prediction of a madman, but I somehow have a weird gut feeling that the next government will be a Labour, Brexit, SNP coalition. And John says, if Corbyn wins the next general election, I'm moving to Venezuela. And Jane A. says, I think with the general election, we'll just go round the mulberry bush time and time again until the people snap. And Lee Cash says, a sad choice of candidates. I'm going Nigel would vote for you. I'm going Nigel would vote for you if I was in West Brom. Do you like the Boris treaty? Well, not much. It's better than Theresa May's, but it wouldn't be the treaty I would have drawn up. And Kat says, I think Boris will win. We'll keep Corbyn and the Remainers out. And CEU later, what a very clever handle, says we need to elect as many Brexit Party MPs as possible. And Jockey Bollingolly Trilson, what a great handle, says I'm for an independent Scotland and I'm for Scotland leaving the EU. Most indie campaigners don't see they lack principles, wanting to be in an ever increasingly bonded union with Europe, but resent their bonded union with England. Both are the same, surrendering sovereignty. And since 2010, says Corbyn and Johnson can't be trusted, but Corbyn is worse. His party is just weird. And the Red Resistance says, if I was Corbyn, I'd stop all this calling the PM Boris, which conjures up a cuddly image of him. I would take every opportunity to call him by his real name, which is Alexander de Pfeffel Boris Johnson. Tells you all you need to know about him and his party. And Hassan Diwan says, would Jeremy Corbyn put party before personal ambition and return to the backbenches? And LM says, I'm proud to say I abstained on the Brexit vote because I knew that I knew nothing and therefore couldn't make informed decisions. Wish the rest of the country had been honest enough to see that it was the same for them. I also was sure we'd survive either way and could negotiate some way back in. Let's take a call, shall we? We've got one from West Yorkshire, Noor. Can I hear from Noor?
Yeah.
Hello, welcome. Sir, welcome.
Hello,
Yeah, you're there. You're on the air. You're talking to the world.
Hello, Noor Mohammed.
Yes, Noor.
Noor Mohammed. Yes, I'm from Keighley. I've talked to you before.
Okay.
A different name then.
Welcome.
Sorry, there's an echo on the phone.
Go on.
I love your show, Joe, and I hope you're well.
Very
George,
well.
sorry.
Thank you very much.
If I can refer to the programme last week, I was a little bit disappointed that you seem to be underestimating Jeremy Corbyn. I'm a huge fan, and I think he's a lovely man and a good man. I do not like Johnson. I think you're possibly a bit too pro him. And I'm going to be extreme here. I think the Tories, as they are now in government, are a bunch of fascists. Johnson is not a lovable country man. I detest him. Well, I don't want to sort of get away from Brexit. What about all the positive things that a Corbyn-led Labour government is going to do?
Well, first of all, I've been accused of many things in my life, but being pro-Boris Johnson is not one of them. Secondly, it's entirely wrong and very dangerous to call everybody to the right of you a fascist or a racist. That's very, very dangerous and actually helps to conjure forth that which you fear most. Because if you go around calling everyone who votes Conservative or is a Conservative a fascist, that's absurd. If they were fascists, there wouldn't be an election. If there were fascists, this radio show would be closed down already. I'd already be in a concentration camp, and with a name like Noor, you'd probably be in the next bunk to me. You shouldn't toss around these kind of loose and foolish appellations to people which are simply unfounded. Now, as for underestimating Jeremy Corbyn, you obviously didn't listen to the first part of the show. We're far from underestimating him. I spoke with Professor Sir John Curtice about his campaigning skills and zeal and the fact that he's still got his mojo. And that is my takeaway from the first week of the campaign, that he's got his mojo. Boris Johnson hasn't yet apparently found his. Last word to you, Noor.
Okay, maybe that was exaggerating, but I've never known a government as viciously right-wing.
Well,
and
you
to
must
be
be very young. You must be very young.
I'm 74, George.
Well,
I'm 74.
in that case, you're losing your memory. Because if you really think that this government, broken-backed, with no majority, is more vicious than Margaret Thatcher, who closed down industrial Britain, then you definitely have lost your memory, or you're not 74. Margaret Thatcher destroyed this country, closed the coal mines, closed the steel works, shut down industrial Britain, desertified industrial Britain, made millions of people unemployed. And you're trying to tell me this clown is more vicious than her? Really?
Right. Will you listen? Hear me out. 130,000 people killed through the DUWP, starting with IDS, under vicious crew after him. I was around during the miners' strike. I remember it very well. My grandfather was a miner. He was killed in Fleischer. He was killed with a coal cutting machine fell on him. My father and most of my relatives were in the RAF, were in the forces during the war. Most of them voted for Attlee after the war. This is an Attlee moment. Our country is in great danger, and I think Jeremy Corbyn could lead us to a new future. It's as idealistic as that.
Well, that's a very powerful peroration. I must congratulate you on it. Thanks very much indeed for your call. Let's hear from Simon in London. Go ahead, Simon.
Hi, George. How are you doing?
Good, sir. Good.
That's good. Basically, I want to talk to you about two things. Firstly, Grenfell Tower. As you probably know, the report came out this week with regards to the safety failures that occurred on both the building and the actual operations that happened with regards to trying to get people out. And I was quite shocked and surprised that the fire brigade bore the brunt of the blame for that. And the fire brigade's union came out. I'm a libertarian. I'm not a fan of the unions, but the fire brigade's unions came out and said this was not an accurate report. I kind of agreed with them. As a civil engineer myself, in any design, it's pretty clear that any design, whether it's permanent or temporary, has to be signed off. And in this case, all you had to do, it was a simple matter of seeing who signed the design certificate off. The fact that they had a cladding which was not fire resistant, and that was one of the reasons why the entire building burned down. And they seem to have missed out in the report, or not even said that this is one of the prime reasons why the building failed. The root cause of the building failing is it's suspect to me. Now, there's two possibilities to this: either the safety team or the team that carried out this root cause analysis were totally stupid, which is possible, believe it or not, or it was a deliberate whitewash.
Well, that's a very powerful call, Simon, and it's particularly close to home for me. I was living in the lee of the Grenfell Tower at the time. My children went to school with many people affected in the most appalling way by the Grenfell fire inferno. My wife had a shop within smelling distance of the burning tower, and so I was deeply involved. I was a school governor in the Grenfell area, so I feel particularly strongly about this. And also I have a lifelong association, until very recently, with the Fire Brigades Union. And I, like you, find it repugnant, unconscionable, intolerable that the firefighters, the people who plunged into the burning building, writing their names on their helmets, which is never a good sign, just in case, as might well have been expected, many of them didn't make it out of that burning building. For men and women who plunge into burning buildings for a living to try and save people's lives and property, to be lined up as the first candidates for punishment and for insult was just about as grotesque as it could possibly be. And ineluctably, this flows from the decision of the inquiry to start at the end rather than start at the beginning. You see, all these other points you made, they will be reached. But already, and I believe deliberately, it has been fixed in the public's mind that the firefighters are somehow to blame for the catastrophe of all these dead, maimed, and permanently damaged people in the Grenfell Tower. They should have started at the cladding. In fact, you can go back further. You said signed off. I've got bad news for you. Well, not if you're a libertarian. You probably weren't a supporter of Tony Blair's government anyway. The people who changed the law so that you no longer needed the fire brigade to sign off a building was not the wicked Tories, but the new Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. It was they who gave council officials the right to sign off a building as safe, whether the firefighters, the fire brigade liked it or not. That's the beginning. Then comes the cladding, arsenic, poison, cladding our tower blocks, immensely inflammable, causing any fire potentially to become a catastrophe. Who made that cladding? Who bought that cladding? Who installed that cladding? Who is responsible for the fact that sprinklers were not working? Who is responsible for the fact that exit, egress in the building was so limited? All of these things have far more to do with the catastrophe than the conduct even of the chief fire officer herself. Now, no public organization is beyond criticism. There may very well be legitimate points to be made about the stay put decision made by the head of the London Fire Brigade. But those firefighters, men and women, who plunged into that burning building ought to be enshrined forever as true British heroes, not villains. And that's what this disgusting verdict of the public inquiry has done, sought to paint them as villains rather than heroes. How's the poll going? Boris Johnson, 38. Jeremy Corbyn, 35. Hung Parliament, 27. 1,748 votes so far. Have I got time for one more call before the break? Let's take a quick call. Richard in Manchester, go ahead.
Good evening, George. Thank you for taking my call.
Welcome, Richard.
George, I was looking up yesterday about Jo Swinson, this wonderful lady who's going to win the next election.
She's the Liberal Democrat leader. Let me just explain that for overseas listeners and viewers.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Please, the world is listening.
Yes.
You tell them to pray for us because we're coming to a big time in our lives as a democratic and one of the greatest nations in the world, George. I've watched you in Parliament stand up for these people who are completely against democracy, and I'm absolutely sick of it. And when I see her name come up as she's the next one, I'm going to be the next Prime Minister, and you get the people over the border in Scotland, another great country, and she wants to go back into the EU. I wonder, George, and I think, who are they married to, these people? And then you look up on Wikipedia, and there you find out that Jo Swinson, her husband was the private parliamentary secretary to Nick Clegg, and he is now he's a man responsible for a thing that it gets about £5 million a year grant from the EU, and you think to yourself, Why are these people being put up for this, George? What are they trying to do? Bring our country down? 17.4 million people, George, as you know, voted to leave, and it was a democratic vote, and we've had Blair, and we've had Campbell, and we've had rubbish thrown at us to say that we are idiots. I would say, please, George, take our plea to the world, not to this country, and tell them what is going on here, because they're trying to democracy, and I think it's an absolute disgrace.
Well, amen to all that, Richard. Very powerful comments indeed. I must say, I find her just about the most unimpressive political leader I have ever seen. And I have no idea why they chose her. When they had old Dr. Sir Vince Cable, at least he was a leader of some sagacity, some ability to communicate with the public, a brain, a man of experience. You could argue he was a bit old and so on. Maybe that's why he left. But I cannot help believing that in exchanging Dr. Sir Vince Cable for Joe Swinson, the Liberal Democrats have taken the Lilliputian option. And I think it's probably already costing them in the public opinion polls. Thanks for the calls. Keep them coming. I'll be back after the news.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold, Goats, and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Demonstrators have blocked the center of Baghdad, defying a curfew, the latest in a wave of protests which have been going on for more than a month. The main roads of Iraq's capital were closed down, with protesters parking cars at key junctions of the city as police looked on without intervening. Students were also staging sit-ins at their schools, and government offices were closed on the first day of the working week in the Muslim nation. Since October 1st, tens of thousands of people have taken part in 2 waves of protests to demand more jobs, an end to corruption, and better services. More than 250 have been killed in clashes with security forces. Next, the world's most profitable company is to go public. Saudi Aramco has confirmed it is planning to list on the Riyadh Stock Exchange in what could be the world's biggest initial public offering, or IPO. The state-owned oil giant will determine the IPO launch price after registering interest from investors. Sources say the Saudis are expected to make shares available for 1 or 2% of the firm. The company is thought to be worth about $1.2 trillion. And the leader of Britain's Brexit party has said he will not be standing as a candidate in the general election on December 12th. Nigel Farage said he had thought very hard but had decided he could serve the cause better by supporting his party's 600 candidates across the UK. I don't want to be in politics for the rest of my life, he said. Farage has stood unsuccessfully for Parliament 7 times now. He also slammed the Brexit deal British Prime Minister Boris Johnson agreed earlier this month as virtually worse than being in the EU. If Boris Johnson was going for a genuine Brexit, we wouldn't need to fight against him in this election, he said. On Friday, Johnson rejected an alliance with Farage's party, saying that doing deals with any other party simply risks putting Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. Today, the Prime Minister also ruled out allowing a second Scottish referendum on independence. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said that she will ask for permission for the referendum within days of whichever Prime Minister is elected. In its latest pre-election promise, the Labour Party is pledging to cut UK carbon emissions by 10% through the largest home improvement programme for decades. A Labour government would fund £60 billion of energy-saving upgrades to low-income households over the next decade, while wealthier households would receive interest-free loans for enhancements. The party said loft insulation, enhanced double glazing, and new heating systems would help cut that energy use. The Conservatives said the plan would wreck the economy and put up bills. Launching the policy called Warm Homes for All in southwest London, Labour's leader Jeremy Corbyn said climate change would be a big part of the party's election campaign. The green industrial revolution, which we're promoting, will create a sustainable energy network in the country, he said. We cannot go on standing by while climate warming increases. Labour says its proposals would create 450,000 jobs involved in the installation of energy-saving measures and renewable and low-carbon technologies. And finally, the black leather jacket and skin-tight trousers that Olivia Newton-John wore for the finale of Grease have fetched over £300,000 at auction, more than double the expected bid. The actress's original script from the film was also among the items at the sale in Beverly Hills, California, which in total raised $2.4 million. Some of the proceeds will go towards Newton-John's Cancer Treatment Center in Australia. Grease was released in 1978, and Olivia Newton-John played Sandy alongside John Travolta as Bad Boy Danny. The infamous black outfit marked Sandy's transition from good girl high school student to a sexy leather-clad biker chick when the couple sang You're the One That I Want in a fairground. Newton-John, age 71, is currently undergoing treatment for stage 4 breast cancer. Well, that's Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're watching the mother of all talk shows, or maybe listening. That's the beauty of this show. It's a radio show with pictures. You can watch us on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, on multiple platforms, or listen to us, of course, on SputnikNews.com. Or, if you're in DC, you can listen on FM on 105.5, or across the United States on AM from coast to coast. Boomer for Bernie says, we too have only one candidate standing up for Julian Assange, Tulsi Gabbard. Of course, she's been accused of being a Russian asset. Well, not half, and I'm on the same shortlist as her. The predictable forces of darkness have released a list of Russian assets that include not just Tulsi Gabbard, but one Donald J. Trump and yours truly, George Galloway. And UK elections, Captain Swiss says, I'd first thought a Tory majority, but I'm questioning whether it may be hung after all. Trying to call into your show. Please, I'd like to speak to Captain Swiss. He's a candidate, I think, in Stoke. And Blessing 1973, sorry I can't read the Irish, it says the future of UK Labour is at stake, so a Corbyn victory is imperative. Otherwise, a decline into a Blairite cesspool is on the cards. And Tim O'Seary says, I must say Galloway's on top form here, lambasting the caller who says that this government is the most right-wing there has ever been. Yes, George, you're right. The Tories now have not done the damage Thatcher did. She closed down industry in the UK and she did a lot worse. And Lynn says there'll be a hung parliament because Boris won't do a deal with Nigel. Now, as I said earlier in my monologue, the so-called war for democracy in Libya has gone just as disastrously, arguably even more disastrously, than the war for democracy in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. The Libyan theatre of operations is still littered with the corpses that Boris Johnson famously said once we'd swept them up. Sirte could be quite a happening place. It was an off-colour, you could say, a rather revolting joke at the time, but it's an even bigger and badder joke now because the bodies are not being swept up, they're being multiplied. The alphabet soup of Islamist extremism, all with their own warlord militias, are still tearing lumps out of each other and anyone caught in the crossfire, and Libya is no longer a state. One man who knows all about that is Maximillian Forte, a professor from Canada who's written a book on this very subject, and I love the title, Slouching Towards Sirte, NATO's War on Libya and Africa. Professor Forte, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure for me to join you today.
And a very good line, I'm glad to say. Tell us, first of all, paint a picture of what Libya is like as we come to the end of 2019, would you?
Yes, well, there hasn't been that much improvement over these last few years. I mean, at the worst point, we had, in effect, four governments competing for power based in different parts of Libyan territory. Among them, a UN-imposed, basically an airdropped government that was based in Tripoli, that has, commands very little support and loyalty on the ground. They've been trying to engineer a kind of new Libya with little success. You've seen a periodic resurgence in the domestic civil war that has erupted in Libya after the end of NATO's intervention. You have a huge portion of the population. I think at the last count, it was certainly more than a third and close to a half of the population that's internally displaced, with hundreds of thousands. This is a population of 6 million in total, hundreds of thousands living as refugees in nearby countries. And then, of course, you have the resurgence in African slavery. So it has been success on all fronts. And I'm not even sure if I'm being sarcastic anymore, because my opinion is that it's not that the West intervened to prevent chaos, it's that it intervened precisely to create it. What it does not want is stability in countries such as Libya, stability in any country that can offer an alternative or a challenge to the kind of new world order that we've been busily trying to build worldwide.
Well, I couldn't dispute with you that that's what it looks like. I do have some doubt about whether that was the intention. I suppose that brings us back to the age-old question, are we ruled by fools or knaves? And which would be worse? The intention of creating a chaotic, balkanized, broken Libya with no borders surely can't have been their intention, because actually nobody's making any money out of it.
Yes, that's been one of the other failures of their policy, because one of the earliest desires, and this was expressed, by the way, in various meetings at the State Department that are on record, even before the United States ceased its bombardment campaign, they were already organizing groups of investors, of American investors, to potentially go into Libya and, reap huge contracts for reconstruction. So destruction was certainly very profitable, especially for some of the interests that are, very prominent in Washington, that are also major donors to various political campaigns and so forth. So there was this kind of eye on profit. But of course, events escaped their control. The groups that they backed began to turn on each other. They began to turn on themselves. There was already, a good amount of evidence of that infighting developing, even in the so-called insurrection against Gaddafi's government. But, they chose to ignore that or to overlook it. So I'm not sure. As I said, even if the intention wasn't a conscious one to create chaos, certainly, our notions of order, and by ours, I mean the notions of order that are dominant in North America and Europe, are precisely the ones that produce and generate and engineer this kind of chaos that we see.
Very well put, I must say. Amongst the many indictments that you listed, perhaps the most shocking one is the resurgence of African slavery. And in fact, this follows the literal lynching of large numbers of black people in the immediate aftermath of the overthrow of the Gaddafi power. Explain what you meant by that to the audience, would you please?
Yeah, well, in fact, for at least 3 years now, if not a bit longer, we've known of the formation of actual slave markets in Libya. Now, these have been filmed. CNN itself has gone there and filmed live auctions of human beings sold for as little as, I believe, $400. Then they're carted off and housed basically in prisons where they work obviously for no wages. And what we don't know, because Libya is such an extremely dangerous place for correspondents and researchers, we don't know how many thousands have been sold into slavery, if it's something that continues on a day-to-day basis, if it has increased, if it has decreased. You would think that this would be a major, priority the world over, to not only know more about slavery in Libya, but to stamp it out. It is, after all, against international law. So there's a vital information that we don't have. But what we do know is that during the war, and for years prior to the war, as a matter of fact, Africans were badly stigmatized in Libya. And during the 2011 war, they were demonized in part by the United States government and various Western agencies, including human rights organizations. They were demonized as mercenaries. Of course, there was no evidence ever found of any mercenaries from Africa having been in Libya during the war. So that was a complete falsehood. And it was used as a justification for lynching virtually any African migrant worker that could be found. So from the beginning to the present, you see Africans in Libya being objectified. They've always been a resource. They're either a convenient excuse for war, or they're cheap labor, or they're used by the European Union in different ways, as a potential threat to shore up European identity, which, as you would know better than I, is always in danger of being tattered into fragments. So it's quite a complicated picture, and I suspect that this is going to continue for some time.
Now, of course, amongst the European values that Sarkozy and Cameron were exemplifying was the bringing of democracy to people who don't have it. They succeeded in destroying Libya, destroying the political power that was there. I'm not a supporter of the Gaddafi system. I have oftentimes opined that it takes some doing to make Libya even more shambolic, 1,000 times more shambolic than it was under its previous political system. Are they ever going to emerge from that, Professor?
This is a question that I'm very interested in, as a matter of fact. Now, on the question of Libya's government pre-2011, you and I may diverge on some points. I happen to think that the system that was built up under Gaddafi was a very effective one, not just in holding together a country that ordinarily would not have held together, but also in developing a system that, as imperfect as it was one of the best existing systems of direct democracy that has existed, simply because very few countries have tried it. Apart from the only other one I can think of was Grenada from 1979 to 1983. So we don't have many examples of direct democracy. What is extremely interesting is a study done by the University of Oxford in conjunction with the University of Benghazi that was published in 2012, that was a survey of political attitudes, political opinions across Libya. And when you go through the statistics, I can't go through it all now, what you get as a kind of composite picture of the system Libyans want, the majority of Libyans, it's precisely the kind of system that they had from 1969 to 2011. In other words, participatory democracy, public ownership of natural resources, not necessarily any need for any multi-party elections. They're not interested in multiple political parties. They don't see great value in electoral politics and competitions between parties. They want a strong national leader, what we would call a strong man. And on it goes. And so basically, the more that they can gravitate back towards what they had already built, the closer they'll get to coming out of this kind of mess that they're in now.
Professor, very powerful indeed. I look forward to reading your book. It's the best title of a book I've seen for some time, Slouching Towards Sirte, NATO's War on Libya and Africa. Published in 2012, I'm sure, still available. Thank you, Professor, for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Now, last week was the week that we learned that the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed caliph, had been killed by an intelligent canine operation announced by Donald J. Trump. If you had listened to the triumphalism of President Trump's announcement, you may have thought that President Trump strangled him to death with his own tiny dino hands. That's almost certainly not true. But here's what I had to say about it in my short for RT this week. Take a look. I'm confident that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead, even though they've killed him several times before. But I sing hallelujah, because al-Baghdadi was the high priest of a death cult, dripping in the blood of uncountable numbers of people, whom he subjected to murder, mutilation, torture, and misery all across Syria and Iraq, and through his devotees, people as far afield as France, as London, and many other parts of the world. I'm not sure that al-Baghdadi died in exactly the way that President Trump so lasciviously described, with the president's own hands around his throat. Neither am I one of those who believes that ISIS was somehow the creation of the West or Israel or any of the other conspiracy theories, except inasmuch as ISIS was really just a rebadging of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda very definitely was a Western, an American creation in Afghanistan in the 1980s, operating on the morally bankrupt principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Well, if your friend is Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, you have a serious problem with your soul. I'm absolutely happy that ISIS have been defeated overwhelmingly by the Syrian Arab army with the support of Russia and Iran and the Lebanese Islamic militia Hezbollah. I'm absolutely convinced that on the battlefield they have been crushed. The problem is that the death of al-Baghdadi does not kill the idea of Islamist extremism, because that came from a swamp of hatred and bitterness that is ever curdling, and indeed is constantly refreshed with mistaken Western policies which caused the creation of that swamp in the first place. We hated the government of Bashar al-Assad so much, we were ready to put guns in the hands of these head-chopping, throat-slitting, heart-eating extremists. And we were ready to propel them all the way to power in Damascus. And if it had not been for the unity of the people of Syria and their Russian ally and their other friends, the black flag of ISIS would today be fluttering atop the buildings in Damascus, on the Mediterranean, next door to Israel. What could possibly go wrong? We must, of course, defeat by arms the last remnants of fanatic Islamist extremism in Syria and Iraq. Al-Baghdadi died in Idlib. Idlib is still under the control of the very Al-Qaeda we brought into being in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We must, of course, defeat on the battlefield all of these forces, but that will not be sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Sufficient means stopping, supporting tyranny and exploitation everywhere in the Muslim world and allow the people to breathe and live like normal people.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Well, that subject was, of course, addressed yesterday by the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, easily the best foreign minister in the whole world. How I wish that he were our foreign minister. Any country would be proud to have him as their foreign minister. And he made the point that I just did, that the Al-Qaeda franchise was a direct result of the policy in the 1980s of arming, financing, and proselytizing for the Islamist extremists in Afghanistan. That's what created Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda and ISIS are sisters under the skin. Now, on this day, on November 3rd, on this day in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first living creature, a dog called Laika, into space. Laika had been fitted with monitors to check its heartbeat and other vital signs, and was reported to be calm during the first hours of the flight. Russian scientists were particularly interested in the effects of solar radiation and weightlessness on living organisms. I'm not reading the next paragraph because it's purely anti-Soviet propaganda. It's probably come from Wikipedia. 3 years later, the Russians achieved another space first by sending the great Yuri Gagarin into orbit on April the 12th, 1961. Now, there used to be a street in Fife, close to where I was born and grew up, called Yuri Gagarin Way. I don't know if it's still there. Perhaps some Scottish viewer or listener could let me know about that. I think it was in Cowdenbeath, but it may have been in one of the other Fife mining towns. Yuri Gagarin made a hugely successful visit to Britain after that epic achievement, the first ever human being into space. He visited Manchester and many other places, hugely successful. The prestige of the Soviet Union at that time was still very high indeed. Not as high as it had been during the Second World War, and we'll be talking about that very shortly. On this day in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was elected President of the United States, defeating hardline Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona by an overwhelming majority. The man who took over the presidency after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy a year earlier got the largest popular majority in U.S. history, greater than FDR's landslide victory in 1936. And FDR we'll be talking about later also. Although Johnson pledged not to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam, soon after his election, he increased the number of U.S. troops, and that continued to mount, reaching a peak of 550,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam in 1968. 58,000 of those, of course, never came home except in boxes. On this day in 1975, the first oil began to flow from the North Sea when the Queen turned on the UK's first oil pipeline. All that money that was wasted on unemployment pay, burned. We could have been contenders with that oil money. And one day somebody has to answer for the fact that when the oil runs out, Britain will be poorer than it was when we first found it. In this week, in 1956, British and French troops seized control of the Suez Canal in an ill-fated invasion. It followed the Israeli invasion of Sinai. However, the US put pressure on Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw from Egypt, and a UN emergency force took over. Britain's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was forced to resign over it. And on this week, on November 9, in 1989, after several weeks of civil unrest, the East German government announced that all East German citizens could visit West Germany and West Berlin. Crowds of demonstrators on both sides of the Berlin Wall, which divided the city, began clambering up on it to start breaking it down. The fall of the Berlin Wall paved the way for German reunification, hip hip hooray, which formally took place on 3rd October 1990 and led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. All of that on this day in this week. Hope you enjoyed that. My thanks, I think, to the people who drew it up. Steve C. says, I don't think the values of Tony Benn, Michael Foot and Barbara Castle included standing against a Labour Party candidate in a general election. Well, I think that's a reference to me, but although I'm perfectly legally entitled to, I have decided not to talk about my own electoral campaign in the upcoming general election because I think it would be unethical and unfair to do so. So, Steve, I hear you, but I'll not be responding to you. Phil Zapp, my old friend in Ireland, says, Libya is chaotic. Iraq is unstable. Syria and Afghanistan burning. What's common between all these countries? An answer from both Galloway and Ask Adam. Hashtag Ask Adam. He's in the wars tonight on Twitter. Will be much appreciated. And LM says, re-Brexit. Don't for 1 second tell me that anything is written in stone, because it isn't, and history shows that. To divide the masses for something that can be changed yet again, depending who's in power and whim, is to be fools. What's being done that we don't see clearly? I'm not sure I entirely follow that, LM. You might want to polish that a bit. Roya says, good show, George. People talking about Brexit referendum. The Brits lost their minds, question mark. If I was Queen of England, I'd put the party leaders in the Tower of London and keep them there. Only normal food, no whiskey, no cigar, till they decide a real Brexit deal which satisfies everyone. There's much more of that, but let me just announce the poll so far. By the way, we're going to run another poll on the back of the Sputnik 2, which took Laika into space. I'm going to ask you who you'd like to fire off into space, into orbit, maybe forever, in a new Sputnik. Anyway, who'll win the British general election? You can vote now on my Twitter feed, at George Galloway. And it's A, Boris Johnson, 36%. B, Jeremy Corbyn, neck and neck, 36%. And C, hung Parliament, 28%. And 2,544 of you have voted so far. Now, I'm asking who will win, not who you'd like to win. I'm asking who will win on the basis of what we know so far, including in what you heard from Professor Sir John Curtice earlier on. Now, Captain Swiss is on the line. I've never met, to the best of my knowledge, Captain Swiss, not under that name anyway, but he is standing in the general election. And let me just say, any candidate who's standing in the general election for any party is welcome to phone up this show, and I will take them. Captain Swiss is the first. Captain.
Hello, George. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Tell us where you're standing, as what, and why, please.
I'm standing in the constituency of Stoke-on-Trent North as an independent, and the main reason I'd say is because I've looked at the parties that are likely to be on the ballot, and I'm really not that excited by any of them. I'm a left-wing Leave voter.
Ah, something like myself then.
Not too dissimilar.
Were you involved in the campaign? Did you vote Leave at the time?
I did, yes. I voted Leave at the time, and then I voted. I was a registered Labour supporter for a few years. I voted for them in the 2017 general election, but I haven't been best pleased by their shift towards Remain.
Well, I think there are quite a few of those. Who's standing in that constituency? And by the way, all candidates are fully entitled to call up and have their say. But tell us, if you would, Captain, who you're running against.
We have incumbent Labour MP Ruth Smith, and then I think we also have a Green, a Brexit Party, and a Conservative candidate.
And I suppose the issue would be, if it's Leave is the issue, if you've got a Brexit Party candidate against you, you may be accused of splitting the vote in a way that allows Ruth Smith back in.
Well, I've had accusations from both sides on this, and I was seeking some advice, actually, given your experience running in elections. I've had Leavers telling me I'll split the anti-Brexit vote, and I've had friends in Labour telling me that I'll split the Labour vote. But I can't seem to win either way, it seems.
Well, you're perfectly entitled to stand. I mean, no one has an obligation to support candidates, parties that they don't actually approve of. And the most effective way is to stand yourself. Have you ever stood in an election before? What sort of vote do you think you'll get?
I haven't stood before. I've considered it in the past, but this is my first time finally putting my head above the parapet, so to speak. I'm hoping to draw Labour voters, Leave voters, some of those who may have been inclined to vote Brexit Party or even Conservatives.
And are you well known locally? Are you standing as Captain Swiss?
No. I'm going to be standing under my real name, but I'm waiting until I've raised the money for the deposit before I make that reveal. Currently, Captain Swiss is my online name for doing YouTube political commentary.
It's quite a good nom de guerre, I must say. So give me your pitch. What would you say to the voters in Stoke?
My pitch to the voters is that if you want to see Brexit done, but you don't necessarily want to vote for a right-wing party in order to do it, I may be your guy. I'm planning to donate half of my earnings as MP to local charities, and I would introduce a private members bill so that constituents would be able to sign a petition to call a by-election if their MPs defect party, because we saw enough of that in the last Parliament.
Well, very interesting platform, I must say. People can follow you on Twitter. Are you at Captain Swiss?
Yes, I am. Captain spelled C-A-P-N and then Swiss.
Captain. Aye, Captain. Thanks very much
aye.
for your call. And as I say, anyone who's running in the election is more than welcome to give us a call. Let me just read some more of the messages. Jet says, who would win the general election? Liberal, Democrats and Labour. Ben Salmon says Boris Johnson will win, but by a margin so meagre that we will be right back where we stand today in terms of delivering Brexit. My old friend Marie McFarlane in Scotland. Marie, I hope I'll see you at East Kilbride, January the 18th at the East Kilbride Village Theatre. The Brexit Party has had 600 candidates for months, all selected and vetted, recently increased to 626, so not to be underestimated. Maybe this is why Rebecca Long-Bailey today mentioned a Labour campaign to leave the EU. I didn't see that reference, Marie. I'll have to look for that after the show. By the way, I'm speaking next Friday at 7 o'clock in the West Brom Working Men's Association Club in the centre of West Brom. That's Friday at 7 o'clock. The title of the meeting is Brexit, Britain and the General Election. Ben Salmon says the Lib Dems have established themselves as the anti-democratic party and will reap the rewards accordingly. And Sean Diamond says the Brexit party winning without Farage, highly unlikely. Let's take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, people sometimes say to me, don't mention the war, and accuse me of being a trifle too over-interested in the Second World War. It's perhaps my age. I was born just 9 years after the end of the Second World War. In fact, the year I was born, Winston Churchill was still the Prime Minister in this country. That's how old I am, but don't tell the wife. She thinks I'm 45. In the year I was born, rationing was ended. Which is a pity, because everything is rationed. It's rationed by price. A ration based on your status as a citizen of the country is actually rather fairer than rationing by price, but that's an argument for another day. I'm also extremely fascinated by the personalities of Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. So this book was right up my street. It is called Churchill and Stalin, Comrades in Arms During the Second World War. And indeed, if they hadn't been, I'd be addressing you now in German, although I'd probably already be dead. One of the authors of this tremendous new book, and I've now read about half of it, is Martin Folly. It's written by Martin Folly, Jeffrey Roberts, and Oleg Rezhevsky. And I'm glad to say that Martin Folly is on Skype right now to talk to us about the book. Martin, thank you for that. You're a professor of history. Indeed, I think you're all professors of histories. One of the three of you is Russian. You've had access to tremendous treasure trove of archive material, some of it not seen before. I found the book absolutely fascinating, and I'm halfway through it already. Sketch for us what the general thesis of the book is, would you?
Yes, good evening, George.
Evening.
Essentially, our thesis is that the war could only have been won by the Allies working together.
Yep.
They were a very ill-matched pairing, particularly Churchill and Stalin, of course, with their long backgrounds. But somehow they managed to work together. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't easy, but they managed it and it worked. And so the central theme of the book is how they managed to manage their differences, how they managed to get on. And in fact, they got on surprisingly well, at least when they met.
Well,
one of the things... Yeah, George?
Yeah, I read, one of the greatest books I read was the diaries of Maysky, the Soviet ambassador throughout the war in London. But I hadn't grasped until I read your wonderful book just how well, particularly Churchill and Stalin, got on. I mean, it turns out, and again, I didn't know this, that actually Stalin and Roosevelt hardly met at all, whilst Churchill met Stalin many times, and many thousands of miles were eaten up to facilitate those meetings. What do you think it was about the chemistry of these two leaders that allowed them to gel so well, and as I say, without which the war might not have, almost certainly would not have been won?
It's an incredibly unlikely thing to happen, isn't it? You've got the grandson of a duke and the son of a blacksmith, but they found a commonality, and I think their commonality was their interest in winning the war. I mean, Churchill, of course, was a man who was fascinated by war, loved fighting war, loved being a warlord. And when he met Joseph Stalin, what he saw in Joseph Stalin was a man who, like him, was at the center of a massive war effort, and was not exactly enjoying it, but in many ways for Joseph Stalin, it was the fulfillment of his life. I think it was the time when he was most stable and in control of things. And so they kind of gelled as comrades in arms, as Churchill himself described it. They had their differences. And one of the things that distinguishes their relationship, I think, and is different than the one with Roosevelt, is that they were very frank with each other. If they disagreed, they said so. And they would argue with each other. And having argued with each other and made their points, I think they then rather respected each other, both of them. And very few people, of course, spoke to Stalin like that. He wasn't surrounded by people who felt it was safe to answer him back. And I think Stalin actually rather enjoyed a real set-to with Churchill.
In fact, Stalin was rather sad when Churchill lost the 1945 general election to be replaced by a Labour Prime Minister.
Well, yes, he was. There was a famous moment at the Potsdam conference when Churchill was taking his leave and going back for the election result. And he said to Stalin, of course, I may not get back, the voters may not return me, though he thought they would. And Stalin looked down the table at Clement Attlee and said, he doesn't look hungry for power. Stalin didn't like Attlee. didn't like Labour Party politicians generally anyway. I think he felt much more at home with Churchill.
It is,
and got on, as I say, he got on with him personally. He's
yeah, you know, there are some lessons for the present in that, aren't there, Martin? That, you know, you have to deal with people in international relations, and to use a Churchill phrase, jaw is better than war. And for me, the genius of Churchill was, the greatness of Churchill was that he refused to capitulate when most of the British ruling class wanted to capitulate, wanted to make a separate deal with Hitler, which would have brought the Second World War to a premature end and would probably have led to a Hitlerite attack to its east on the Soviet Union once its hegemony over Western Europe had been secured. Churchill, by his refusal to capitulate, made that impossible. And secondly, his surely correct perception that whatever other differences existed with the USSR and its leader, together was the only way that you were going to defeat fascism, defeat Hitler.
I think he was very clear about that. And another important moment was a year after that, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. It was by no means certain that Britain would align with the USSR. And there were a lot of people in British politics, both on the left and the right, who were not very comfortable with an alliance with the Soviet Union. And that decision was Churchill's. He took that on his own, made a broadcast on the evening of the 22nd of June, where he aligned Britain up with the Soviet cause without really consulting anybody else. That was his decision. And I think it was a very, very important one, because it didn't have to be that way. A lot of people were very cautious, wanted to bide their time and see what happened. And he made a clear commitment. And I think Stalin never really forgot that.
I'm sure, and that was important. Of course, Churchill was by then in a very strong position. He was able to make that kind of pronunciamento without, because if he'd taken it to the cabinet, he might well have lost. So it was a moment when, because, you know, it's often said, especially by Marxists, that great men don't make history and so on. But there is a role for great men at moments like that, isn't there?
Yes, there is. There are moments when a decision has to be made, and it's not inevitable. The Second World War would have gone very different if you hadn't had Churchill and Stalin in those positions.
Now, one of the complaints, surely justifiable, at least from my point of view, that Stalin had of Churchill and FDR was the never-ending delay in launching the Second Front. There was a big campaign here in Britain, Second Front now, demanding D-Day as early as 42, if not 43, but we didn't get it until June of 44, and perhaps we only got it then because of the dramatic victories that the Soviet Union, the Red Army, were making in the East. I haven't got to that yet in your book. How have you covered the constant demands of the Soviet leadership for a second front?
Well, it's pretty clear, I think, that if Churchill had a fault in handling Stalin, he had a tendency to make rather rash promises. And on a number of occasions, he gave Stalin the impression that Britain was going to be more active than it actually was. And now I think partly Churchill was deluding himself, because he really wanted to be, but he kept getting held back either by his advisors or by the sheer reality of the fact that he didn't have the force to put into the field. So it's very widely debated as to whether the Allies could have done a second front earlier. My feeling is that they really needed to be more honest with their Soviet allies and tell them very clearly why they couldn't. And I'm afraid they made some very extravagant promises, and Roosevelt was just as bad at that as Churchill.
Now you quote in the book that old saw that the Soviet Union gave its blood, the Americans gave their money. And what was it you said that Churchill and Britain gave?
Well, this was a phrase that Stalin came up with, where he said Britain gave time. So that Britain's great contribution was staying in the war from 1940 onwards and basically keeping Germany at war and keeping the threat of a second front open, that Hitler was never able to fight a war on only one front. He always had to be concerned about his rear and about the Mediterranean. And I think Stalin, who had a very keen strategic mind, appreciated that. Obviously, he wouldn't say that in his interactions with Churchill because he wanted to goad Churchill into action. But he had a pretty smart military brain and understood, I think, that by stretching Germany as much as possible, that was contributing to the final outcome.
Now, finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Professor, amongst the things that weren't inevitable, the Cold War, you argue, wasn't inevitable. And in fact, at the end of the war, it was the intention of the three leaders that the Grand Alliance, as I think Churchill called it, should continue. Where did it all go wrong?
This is a much debated question, of course, and I think our main point is some people tend to see the origins of the Cold War way in the Second World War and to blame Roosevelt, blame Churchill, and very much from the evidence, it's quite clear that all three powers intended to carry on cooperating, including Stalin. He thought that the Grand Alliance worked in pragmatic terms, that they understood each other, they understood each other's interests. It only really starts to go wrong after the war, at least partly, I think, and this is my personal view, it may not be shared by my other authors, is that because Britain so dramatically lost power after the war, the Grand Alliance was based on the idea of three equals, kind of balancing each other up as a triangle. And Britain just lost its power after the war for all sorts of reasons. And it left a great gap in international politics. And it left a lot of uncertainties. You know, Britain had been a world power for 200 years, and neither the Soviet Union nor the United States really knew what to do about that. And they started pushing against each other in the areas that the British had previously dominated, like the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And neither power was really used to that kind of international politics, particularly the Americans, who were trying to work out how the United States should be a world power in a way the United States had never really needed to be before. So I think it's the post-war situation that causes the problems. Whether that could have been dealt with in a more sensible way is up for debate, I think. Both sides make mistakes, perhaps overestimate each other's intentions. It's a subject for another book in many ways.
Well, Godspeed that other book, because that's in a way just as important as the story you tell here, which is a truly tremendous one. I mean no hollow flattery. It's a wonderful piece of work. Churchill and Stalin, comrades in arms during the Second World War. Available, I hope, Professor, from all good bookshops, but all the usual platforms too?
I hope all good bookshops, but certainly to popular online booksellers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. That's Professor Martin Folly, co-author with Jeffrey Roberts and Oleg Rezhevsky, which is a fantastic cover also, great title, and a really, really great read. The poll, who will win the British general election? No change. 2,933 votes in so far. Boris Johnson, 36%. Jeremy Corbyn, 36%. Hung Parliament, 28%. That is too close for comfort. And I wonder if it's entirely justified by today's opinion polls. After all, the opinion polls are universally giving Boris Johnson a substantial enough lead. Not that substantial in one case, 8%, but very substantial In another case, in the Observer, 16%. So I wonder what it is that is making people think that actually that's not how it's going to end up. I'll be discussing it with Adam Garrie, hashtag AskAdam, in the final hour. And you can have your say also. You can call me 0207 798 2255. You can also tweet me at George Galloway, at RTUK, at GG Moats. Well, we're unbelievably almost at the end of the second hour. But the good news is that means there's another hour still to come. And we like to dedicate that hour to your calls and your tweets. But Adam will be here to answer some of the criticism that has been made online about his, how shall I put it, robust views on Jeremy Corbyn and today's Labour Party. I just want to say this to some critics. There would be absolutely no point in me being accompanied by me, a kind of stereophonic radio broadcast where me and the other person have exactly the same views on every matter. As it happens, I have the same view as Adam Garrie on some important matters, and I have very different views from him on others. Isn't that what freedom of speech is supposed to be about? So I don't mind you being angry at Adam. By all means, call up and express it. But please don't imagine that I'm going to remove Adam Garrie from our wonderful mother of all talk shows because some of you don't like what he has to say. That's the point of a university, especially of the airwaves. I'll be right back with the final hour.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Fios TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold, Guts, and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Demonstrators have blocked the center of Baghdad, defying a curfew, the latest in a wave of protests which have been going on for more than a month. The main roads of Iraq's capital were closed down, with protesters parking cars at key junctions of the city as police looked on without intervening. Students were also staging sit-ins at their schools, and government offices were closed on the first day of the working week in the Muslim nation. Since October 1st, tens of thousands of people have taken part in 2 waves of protests to demand more jobs, an end to corruption, and better services. More than 250 have been killed in clashes with security forces. Next, the world's most profitable company is to go public. Saudi Aramco has confirmed it is planning to list on the Riyadh Stock Exchange in what could be the world's biggest initial public offering, or IPO. The state-owned oil giant will determine the IPO launch price after registering interest from investors. Sources say the Saudis are expected to make shares available for 1 or 2% of the firm. The company is thought to be worth about $1.2 trillion. And the leader of Britain's Brexit party has said he will not be standing as a candidate in the general election on December 12th. Nigel Farage said he had thought very hard but had decided he could serve the cause better by supporting his party's 600 candidates across the UK. I don't want to be in politics for the rest of my life, he said. Farage has stood unsuccessfully for Parliament 7 times now. He also slammed the Brexit deal British Prime Minister Boris Johnson agreed earlier this month as virtually worse than being in the EU. If Boris Johnson was going for a genuine Brexit, we wouldn't need to fight against him in this election, he said. On Friday, Johnson rejected an alliance with Farage's party, saying that doing deals with any other party simply risks putting Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. Today, the Prime Minister also ruled out allowing a second Scottish referendum on independence. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said that she will ask for permission for the referendum within days of whichever Prime Minister is elected. In its latest pre-election promise, the Labour Party is pledging to cut UK carbon emissions by 10% through the largest home improvement programme for decades. A Labour government would fund £60 billion of energy-saving upgrades to low-income households over the next decade, while wealthier households would receive interest-free loans for enhancements. The party said loft insulation, enhanced double glazing, and new heating systems would help cut that energy use. The Conservatives said the plan would wreck the economy and put up bills. Launching the policy called Warm Homes for All in southwest London, Labour's leader Jeremy Corbyn said climate change would be a big part of the party's election campaign. The green industrial revolution, which we're promoting, will create a sustainable energy network in the country, he said. We cannot go on standing by while climate warming increases. Labour says its proposals would create 450,000 jobs involved in the installation of energy-saving measures and renewable and low-carbon technologies. And finally, the black leather jacket and skin-tight trousers that Olivia Newton-John wore for the finale of Grease have fetched over £300,000 at auction, more than double the expected bid. The actress's original script from the film was also among the items at the sale in Beverly Hills, California, which in total raised $2.4 million. Some of the proceeds will go towards Newton-John's Cancer Treatment Center in Australia. Grease was released in 1978, and Olivia Newton-John played Sandy alongside John Travolta as Bad Boy Danny. The infamous black outfit marked Sandy's transition from good girl high school student to a sexy leather-clad biker chick when the couple sang You're the One That I Want in a fairground. Newton-John, age 71, is currently undergoing treatment for stage 4 breast cancer. Well, that's Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're listening or watching the mother of all talk shows here in London, broadcasting throughout the world. And I really mean throughout the world. As I told you, the last 2 shows have been dramatic spikes in the audience. 15% up the previous week, another 10% up last week, making a quarter, 25% increase across just 2 Sundays. And all the signs are that the show is even bigger this week. I'm joined, as always, in the final hour by my friend, the cleverest man in England, even though he may politically make an error or 2 or 10, he's still my friend. He's Adam Garrie. Welcome back to the show, Adam. Let me, just before I turn to you, give you the final hour poll. Who would you send into space? I told you earlier that on this day, Laika in Sputnik 2 was launched into orbit, and very successfully. I believe the Soviet government, when it said that she lived for a week and died peacefully. Wikipedia tells you something different, but that's just propaganda. So I'm asking, who would you send into space? A, Simon Cowell, B, Donald Trump, or C, your choice. You can, this is a write-in. You can write in your choice. So far, 29% of you say Simon Cowell should be jettisoned up into space forever. 43% say Donald Trump, and 27% have opted for other, but I haven't got any of those others yet. A couple, Tony Blair, he's up there. Tony Blair's up there. All of Parliament, all of Congress. I think it'd be a big spaceship. Boris Johnson, my goodness. So put them up on the screen for me, will you?
It's the first time Tony Blair hasn't run away from people shooting objects at other people.
Yeah, exactly. Tony Blair's normally firing the rockets.
Yes.
Kelly Lane says, re your show last week. Thank you, Craig Murray, for keeping us informed about the Julian Assange case. The US is a bully. Why won't people wake up? And Jason Carmichael says about Chris Williamson being deselected, bitter irony that Chris is the MP I remember most supportive of a reselection. Life is funny sometimes. And Socialist Tipster says, George, on top form on Syria, let's not forget the Tory government actively supported the dismembering of Syria. David Cameron's 70,000 moderate rebels turned out to be allies of Al-Qaeda. The one huge positive about Corbyn as Prime Minister is that that won't happen again. Chewy Chewbarker says Gagarin Way is a play by Scottish playwright Gregory Burke, named after a street in the West Fife village of Lumfinnans on the edge of Cowdenbeath. Now, here's a fact, Chewy, a lamentable one, that Lumfinnans is the poorest place in Great Britain. Official. Sandra Crawford says Landsman will never be voted for again by most Momentum members. If Chris is expelled or not allowed to stand, that will be the last straw. I know many Momentum members who've had enough already. Well, of course, there are no votes in Momentum because well, it's a private company owned by a certain Mr. Landsman. Alexander Dowding says it will most likely be a hung parliament. The ratio has surely not changed all that much since 2016. The vote will be split almost 50-50 again between Leavers and Remainers. Now, that's the point, isn't it, Adam? That if it's a Brexit election, then if the Leave and Remain camps are divided between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the Welsh Nationalists and the Scottish Nationalists, and the Brexit camp is divided between the Conservatives and the Brexit Party, it's very unpredictable.
Indeed, the last 3 days have been frankly shocking, and for someone who's a hardline Brexiteer, quite depressing from the level of tactics and the maturity that one would expect of seasoned people. The key to this election is going to be in England and Wales. Scotland is more or less a foregone conclusion. Supermajority of SNP seats in Scotland. Northern Ireland, much as last time, will be split between DUP MPs who will take their seats and Sinn Féin MPs who obviously never take their seats. So it's going to come down to England and Wales. And England and Wales, on the whole, are Brexit country because it was those two nations of the four that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit.
I mean, if there had been no Scotland, no North of Ireland in the 2016 referendum, the Leave majority is huge.
Oh, astronomical. And lo and behold, without wanting to insult anyone from any of the four nations, when you combine England and Wales's population, that's the vast majority of people in the UK. I know Ian Blackford doesn't think that that's how things work. Maybe he's been taking maths lessons from Diane Abbott, which is a bit different than taking technology lessons from a pole dancer, but there's lots of poor lessons being learned all around. I have to say this, and I take pain in saying it. There's no pleasure. I've fallen out of love with the Brexit Party. I think that a terrible decision has been made, and at many levels. First of all, the idea that a party that has no representation in either of the Houses of Parliament shouldn't have its leader standing in an election is a kind of vote of no confidence that I would have expected from someone as utterly crass as Emily Thornberry, but not something I would have expected from a man who had typically been a master tactician like Nigel Farage. Secondly, the absolute radical nonsense which would make William Gladstone blush about a written constitution, something that even Tony Blair wouldn't dare force upon the country that he helped destroy, helped turn my stomach on inside out before it fell to my shoes. And thirdly, their inability to read the feeling in the country. I've read the Boris Johnson Treaty. I don't particularly like it. Nigel Farage has the same position. But most people in the country won't have read that treaty. What they will know is a deeper truth, because all truth is ultimately simple. And as a Democrat, I've always trusted the people to find the truth. There are really two choices in this election for people that care about Brexit. There's Brexit a year to 3 years to 5 years from now, if the Conservatives have a majority, and there's no Brexit at all if Labour have a majority or there's some sort of Remain coalition between Labour, the Liberals, and possibly even the SNP. Those are the two choices. Brexit isn't going to happen in any recognisable form anytime soon, but it could happen further on, because no treaty is permanent, no government is permanent. Things change, and if England and Britain are to survive, that means that one must fight battles not just today, but tomorrow and the day after. I think that the Brexit Party have frankly borrowed the gun that Corbyn was shooting himself in the foot with over his Brexit policy, and they've put a hole in their own shoes.
Why do you think they did that?
Looking at Farage at his press conference at the end of last week, and looking at him again on the Mort programme, he had a face that I've seen many times in my life, and it's the face of a man who had had 10 years of James Bond-style winnings at a casino, and he just lost it all. The house, the car, possibly the wife as a result of that, and that was the look on his face. The energy was low, the articulation was high, because it always is with him, but he seems like a beaten man, and he's making a decision that I think is tactically poor, because we live in the real world, and the decision he made is one that I think isn't really compatible with the real world. Again, I would have expected Diane Abbott to think 2 + 2 is 10, or Emily Thornberry not to know which country to invade first, a kind of Tony Blair in a gin distillery, but I expected better from the Brexit Party. Brexit supporters expected better, and all you need to do, look at Aaron Banks, look at everyone, frankly, except Richard Tice, who has money and influence on the Brexit side, is incredibly disappointed. Farage's own former UKIP deputy, Godfrey Bloom, an Austrian economics expert, has reached the same conclusion. It's been a dismal and depressing last couple of days.
Let's take a call. We've got Azad in Hemel Hempstead. Azad, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm a great admirer, fan of yours, George, first and foremost, let me say that.
Thank you, sir.
But one thing where you and I may disagree is one issue. But my main thing, George, was I love history, and I've read as much as I can possibly. Now I'm retired a bit also. Sometimes I don't remember everything. But I'm always amazed that in Britain, after the Second World War, when Churchill was a hero, the massive swing where the Labour Party came in with Attlee. And during that time, I read all the very papers, there a lot of problems that the Labour Party had with the trade unions, endless dockers strike, this strike, so on. And then you had the 13 years of what Harold Wilson called 13 years of misrule. Yet during that 13 years, the Tory government more or less carried on with the Labour Party policy of getting rid of slums, house building, public services. None of these privatisation ever entered into those type of Tory grandees. Then come Harold Wilson, and 5, 6 years later he was chucked out, God knows why, and then eventually he had another experience. Then come Maggie Thatcher, who decimated our working class industries, all the type, and that's the type of era when I used to work in various places. All have disappeared. I used to work as a welder, things like that. But all disappeared, and yet I was amazed during my entire connection with ordinary British people, the number of people who do ordinary jobs, yet they vote for the Tories. And
well,
so then you have the Tories.
That's a big question. We don't really have time to do it full justice, but it's a very smart question. There is a phenomena about people voting against their own interests, but I tend to be with Adam that the people can generally be trusted to find the truth. And the truth is that Labour in 1945 indisputably was a party that stood up for the working class. It was working class itself. It had leaders and supporters who were not working class, but it unarguably stood in the interests of working class people. Moreover, it had a program for Britain which was 100 miles more radical than Jeremy Corbyn's program for Britain. The creation, imagine, from the desert of charitable health care for the poor and private health care for those that could afford it. The creation of a free at the point of need national health service. The nationalization of the coal industry in which hundreds of thousands of men worked, and 1,000 years of coal under our feet, which is still there, by the way, and the nationalization of other important sinews of the British economy, the tremendous overhaul of war damage, rebuilding, the building of council houses like the one that I grew up in from the age of 5, my slum cleared by the Labour government of 1945 and the Conservative governments which succeeded it, which is the second of my points. Attlee's victory changed the terms of trade. A consensus, they called it Butskillism, grew up in the country, where by and large the 1945 to 50 transformations in Britain were more or less left alone. There was a bit of difference here, a bit of difference there, but the essential paradigm left by the Attlee government was left untouched. And that did not begin to break down until the Thatcher victory in 1979. But what then happened was that Labour became a party that was unrecognizable, not just politically, but culturally, maybe even more importantly, culturally. You could have all kinds of so-called left-wing policies, but if culturally you have nothing in common with the working class, if culturally you don't look like, sound like, feel like you actually are of the working class, then you begin to have a problem. And that problem manifested itself most perfectly in the crushing defeat for Labour under Ed Miliband in 2015 and the crushing defeat of Gordon Brown in 2010. That's my take on it. Adam will have a different one. Adam?
Not necessarily. I think that one thing we've got to remember about 1945 is that one could make an argument that in spite of the intellectual Bloomsbury fringe of the Labour Party that there was more morality, more Christianity, and more ethics among the Labour MP intake in 1945 than there was in the other two main parties of the day.
There were many of them in uniform.
Indeed.
Major Healy, Attlee also, I think, was a major. Many of the Labour MPs elected in 1945 entered the House in their uniforms.
Absolutely right. And when you combine, and that it was a saner time for the country, I think, because especially after 1945, no one could really argue that the patriotism of one side was different than another. In the 1930s, there was opposition to war, much of it noble from both sides. When the war came, everyone, to a great extent, to an overwhelming extent, did their duty. Since the era of Jenkins, where I think it all began to go horribly wrong for the Labour Party in terms of being one of national cohesion and one that respected cultural tradition as opposed to economic tradition, because, of course, both of those things, while somewhat related, are different, because economics doesn't tend to have the important emotional component that culture does in terms of tradition. Starting with Roy Jenkins and then finishing off with Tony Blair, and now when we look at the Labour Party today, you have a party of people that are culturally so alien to anything remotely traditional. And I realise that the Liberals are no better and that the Tories haven't even really put up a fight. You know, the sea light is on, but the Conservatism hasn't been home for quite some time. Maybe that will change, one can hope. But Labour have become a party of cosmopolitanism, where the country outside of London and a few other city centres has tended to cling on to its values, sometimes gripping against hope, because the forces of the state in the control of the cosmopolitans have tried to hoist this culture off of people as though someone ripping the clothes off a married woman in the middle of a street. But the Labour Party is doing themselves no favours with this, and with Brexit, the penny dropped. Because when you have a binary A-B choice between province or nationhood, and when Labour is on the side of being a province, then it all started to become clear. The Emperor became exposed for having no clothes, but the Emperor was building his postmodern empire from the era of Jenkins right through to the present day.
Azad, are you still there? What's your final word?
Yeah. Yeah, my final word is that where Labour got badly defeated was during the time of Michael Foot and Tony Benn. From that onward, and yet during that period where British industry was being decimated, as you rightly said, Maggie Thatcher won every election after every election.
Yeah, that's true. She won the 1983 election on the back of the Falklands War mania, I would call it. But she won the 1987 election, and she should not have. Labour's leader, Neil Kinnock, was nobody's real idea of a proper Prime Minister, don't you think?
No. Well, he was elected by the Labour Party.
Yes, but
so in a sense, that was democracy. You have to respect that. He did.
You'll have to work hard to make me respect Neil Kinnock.
No,
anyway,
I agree, George. But he was better performance than Michael Foot. I mean, Michael Foot.
I disagree.
No, I disagree.
Michael Foot was truly honourable.
I'm broken-hearted.
I'm a great fan of Michael Foot. Don't get me wrong.
I'm broken-hearted at you saying that, Azad, because I've got to tell you.
Don't get me wrong. I love Michael Foot. He was.
I think he looks a lot better in retrospect than perhaps he did at the time.
That's very true. I mean, I think he probably would have made a superb Prime Minister.
Michael Foot was, in terms of culture and erudition and fidelity to the ideals of the Labour Party. I speak with some, I'm party pre, because when Tony Blair was expelling me from the Labour Party, Michael Foot, very old by then, came along and gave evidence in my support and begged. He begged the National Executive not to do this. Anyway, Azad, thank you. A lovely call. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Let's hear from Jim in Gateshead. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, George. Hi, Adam. Great, Sean. I love you very much, George.
Thank you, bro.
Yeah, Well, I follow Adam on Twitter, and he's mentioned it tonight on the show about the written constitution and how it would be so bad for the country.
Yeah.
I was sort of hoping that he would maybe elaborate on that.
That's a good point, yeah. I suspect there's a lot of people asking themselves that. Jim, thanks for that opportunity. Adam?
Well, I didn't really hear the call due to a technical error.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what it was. Jim's asking, and I suspect a lot of people are, why are you so against a written constitution?
Oh, right.
What are the main arguments against it?
First of all, there's the argument of what the current constitution is, which is a living, breathing constitution, which is largely written, although not codified in a single corpus of text. But in addition to that, the unwritten elements are the institutions of state. What makes the institutions of state that Corbyn mocks and that Burko, from a totally different political perspective, mocks, it's not about the pointy shoes or about tights or anything like that. What it fundamentally comes down to is that when an institution is alive, when an institution shapes constitution through its own actions and by respecting precedent as is defined in the very judicial structure of the common law, which is paralleled by the legislative structure, it gives meaning to these institutions. In a more pragmatic sense, though, there's the issue of written constitutions holding countries back or otherwise being ignored. Let's take the US Constitution, which certainly has some very good things in it. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. Many good things. The problem, though, is twofold. In America, most callers here, especially on this show, love the NHS. I love the NHS. Some people don't think I do, but I actually do more intimately than many might presume. You couldn't have an NHS in America because it would be unconstitutional. But in Britain, you could have one because the Constitution is flexible. Even more importantly, perhaps, when you've got a written constitution, it's counterintuitively easy to ignore because you've got legislators in countries like America who, for at least since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was established, but even before, they've been doing everything but defecating on the Constitution. But because it's a document that's behind a piece of glass in a museum, you could say, we're not abandoning the Constitution. Look, we haven't set flame to it. We haven't had a revolution. The Constitution's there, but they're not actually obeying it. When one has an unwritten Constitution, it means the rules are constantly being scrutinized, and there's actually more of an attuned effort that's made into making sure that the Constitution is obeyed rather than disobeyed, because in a country like America, we can disobey the Constitution today, and then it will go through a highly politicized court system, and by the time a judge has made a ruling, we'll have already slipped out from under the atrocious mistake we've made.
Well, look, Jim, let me add to what Adam said. You could say that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act was a kind of written constitution.
Oh, yes.
And look at the mess that has produced. A country with a parliament that can neither go forward nor back, can neither move this way nor that, could actually have continued all the way to 2022 because it was written down that you had to have a 5-year parliament. It's much better, is it not, for a flexible, living, organic relationship to exist, whereby, like the camel, it's difficult to define, but easy to recognize. It's been easy to recognize for many months now that Britain needed a general election, but we almost didn't get one because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Last word to you, Jim.
Well, I was just thinking about what Adam had said there, because obviously if we wrote a constitution today, it would be different to what the Americans wrote when they wrote it. And for instance, say it's like we couldn't have an NHS. Surely we could enshrine the NHS in it and enshrine our liberties in it. And, as I said, maybe, because Adam had said the only people that are going to benefit from it are communists, and maybe my leanings are too communist. I don't know.
Well, There may be some others of your ilk listening and watching the show, Jim. Don't be apologetic about that. Thanks for the call. It's obviously a big subject that we're going to have to return to again. I asked, who would you send into space? 29% say Simon Cowell, 44% say Donald Trump, 27% have a different choice. And they include Jeremy Corbyn, 21 votes to send him into space, Tony Blair, 17 votes, George Galloway, 8 votes to send me into space. Thanks for listening and watching, though. Boris, Netanyahu, Modi, Dominic Grieve, Donald Tusk, Sadiq Khan, Joe Swinson, she got 12 votes, Gina Miller, Hillary Clinton, Piers Morgan, and Alastair Campbell. And Paul Booker wants to send Adam Garrie into space. Well, let's see if there are any more callers on the line. If there are not, let me give you some comments. People are listening tonight from Zimbabwe, Norway, Nigeria, France, Saudi Arabia, Croatia, New Zealand, and Germany, amongst many others. George McEwen says, do you still believe in a free Ireland, but not a free Scotland? Well, George, that's a particularly bovine observation. It's bovine for this reason. Ireland is not free, but Scotland already is free. Scotland could have voted for independence from the rest of Britain at any time from 1929, the achievement of full adult universal suffrage. But it did not do so. It freely decided not to do so. Moreover, though maybe you're too young to remember it, George, in 2014, we had a referendum where the question was binary, A or B. Do you want to leave the United Kingdom or remain in it? Do you want Scotland to be an independent country? Vote yes. Do you want to remain in the United Kingdom? That was the question. What was the answer, George? It was 55 to 45 not to become an independent Scotland. That's freedom, George. That's called self-determination. You freely decided. We freely decided. It was a right that we had that has never been given to the people of the occupied 6 counties of the north of Ireland. They were torn from their motherland by force and by the threat of terror and force. They have never been allowed, since 100 years nearly, when they overwhelmingly voted to be independent and united, they have never been allowed the freedom that Scotland has had every general election since 1929. So I spit upon your question. I consider it vile for you to compare a free country like Scotland that freely decides to remain with England and Wales in Britain with Ireland that is held in bondage and has been for a century. For you to make that comparison, I spit upon it. I regard it as an obscenity. Anne Barnes says, what do you think if Nigel teamed up with Boris? That's just not going to happen, though, Adam, is it?
No, for multiple reasons. There was always going to be the danger of the Dominic Cummings-Nigel Farage personal rivalry, but it seems as though a good number of people close to Downing Street more or less overruled Cummings in his hatred of Farage, and that they were interested in talking to him, but they were cautious. They let Farage make the first move in the chess game, and he made a poor move. He could have given them a bargain that could have been as follows: we'll only stand a defined number of candidates in places where the Tories have never won, but where Leave won in 2016, and where the the Labour incumbent is a Euro fanatic. And in exchange for that, something like proportional representation could have been on the table. Something like a cabinet post at the Board of Trade could have been in it for the Brexit Party, who could have played a very important role in negotiating the potentially 3 years long transition period with the European Union. But instead, Farage essentially said, give up your baby and we'll do a deal with you.
That was an absurd demand, really. I mean, as he spoke it, he must have known it, and everyone who heard it, upon hearing it, must have known it, that to demand that Johnson now scrap the deal that he achieved with the EU and which has now gone through Parliament and which has united his party, at least, in a general election which has already begun, to demand that Johnson rip it up was guaranteed, it was designed, perhaps, to be refused.
And it just doesn't, it makes as much sense as Labour saying, oh, to Thatcher, give the Falklands to Argentina and we won't stand against you in the north of England. I mean, OK, obviously that's a bit more absurd, but only a little bit.
Mikael says, I love how the brainwashed Americans get triggered by Russia. Every time you say Russia, they get ready to explode. I was on the shortlist, did you know that?
I saw that, yes.
I'm on a very short list of Russian assets. I'm just waiting for President Putin to get the sword out and knight me. Kwadwo Akosa says, Thatcher is dead. Focus your angst on the living. Well, we're all still living with the legacy of Mrs. Thatcher, I'm sorry. Helen Kerr says, being working class, our family always voted Labour. Thankfully, I vote SNP now. I can't stand the rest of them. Joshua Buckle says, both parties are horrible and don't know what they're doing anyway. I may vote Liberal Democrat, my goodness. And Alice Hunter says that Boris's deal is 95% May's deal, which was voted down 3 times. And Planetary Citizen says, I think Katie Hopkins should be sent into space. And Carol says, my ex-husband should be sent into
That's the
space.
tweet of the night, I think.
That is the tweet of the night. Now, how's it going? Trump's still ahead, 45%. Cowell, 29%. I don't know why people hate Cowell so much. Your choice, 26%. Corbyn, hey, there's still a significant number of people want to send me into space. But then I wouldn't be able to present this show that you're watching and listening
But you could have a street named after you in 5.
Exactly. George Galloway Way, or just George Galloway.
Quite like that.
Tom is in San Francisco. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, gentlemen, how are you?
Very well, thanks. Better for hearing from you.
Thanks for taking the call. Hey, I'm thinking, I have a thought, and I'd like to run it past you. I'd like to get your opinion.
Yeah.
If Mr. Corbyn does not get sent to space and he actually succeeds in the upcoming election, do you think that improves the chances for a turnaround in what we sadly seen occur in the so-called court hosting Julian Assange? I think that is something that it may be the only possible political discourse that may positively affect him right now.
Adam.
Well, as a supporter of Julian Assange, I take no pleasure in saying this, but if Corbyn can't even control who gets to stay in the Labour Party, I don't think he'll be able to control who the American government puts in or out of prison. So I don't think that the outcome of this election is going to affect Assange one way or the other. I think that there are a lot of idealists who still think that there's some sort of valor to be found when it comes to Assange, and there is some. One of the only journalists that I respect, Peter Hitchens, said that while he doesn't like a lot about Assange, he thinks his treatment is appalling. And even a decade ago, before Blair's vandalism of the Constitution, there would have been a lot of jurists in high places willing to say something almost identical to what Peter Hitchens said. But I think at this point, Assange's future, his destiny, is in American hands, and I don't see a happy ending. I pray I'm wrong, but that's where we are.
Only one member of Parliament has campaigned for Julian Assange, and that's the one member of Parliament that Jeremy Corbyn's NEC, is poised to axe on Wednesday. So the thesis that you advanced, Tom, doesn't have much going for it. Corbyn once spoke out for Julian Assange. He then quickly retreated and said that he should be deported, extradited to Sweden, not the United States. But he has never returned to the issue since. And that is for, I'm afraid, one of the saddest of reasons. He is beholden to a group of parliamentarians, particularly women parliamentarians, particularly liberal parliamentarians with a small L inside the Labour Party, that simply won't allow him to give the kind of support to Assange that I'm sure in his heart he would like to do. He had to backtrack on the one occasion that he did speak about it because of pressure from feminists, men and women, inside the Labour Party that just could not allow the Labour Party to demand justice for Assange. But I'll tell you what, Adam, surprises me even more, because I know the Labour Party so well, I'm not surprised. Not a single Conservative, not one, has spoken up for Julian Assange. Now, when I was in Parliament, there were always dozens, maybe scores, of libertarian people in the Conservative Party in Parliament. I can think of them now who would have been up on their feet pointing out the monstrosity.
Alan Clark, maybe.
Alan Clark, for sure, is one of them. Left-wing, right-wing Conservatives, but people who would have refused to be silent in the face of such an injustice as this.
I blame David Cameron because he did to his party what Blair did to his. He created a kind of brain drain. He created this kind of cookie-cutter, Barbie doll, Ken doll version of what a member of Parliament should be. And I think that it's absolutely disgraceful, because one of the things that made the institution of Parliament so important was that it was a free institution. One of the amendments to the Constitution, pardon me, to the Bill of Rights of this country, that David Cameron once infamously said didn't exist because he wanted to create one. God help us, thank God that he didn't get that. It says that Parliament is a place where free speech is guaranteed. And yet by essentially shortlisting the mediocre and bamboozling and kicking out those who have a strong mind and a strong presence, you've now got political parties that really are just echo chambers of themselves rather than places where voices can be heard.
Last word to you, Tom.
Well, it's given me some clarity. It's not great news, but it's what we've got to say.
Sorry,
it's a rim of the court over there. Sorry, boys.
Sorry, we can't cheer you up. We'd love to. Thanks, Tom, for that. Okay, the polls have now closed. Who will win the British general election? 36% say Boris Johnson, 36% say Jeremy Corbyn, and 28% say a hung Parliament. And there were 3,096 votes cast. 1,465 votes were cast as to who we should send into space, and I'm afraid it's Donald Trump that is on the spaceship headed for... as Donald would put it earlier in the week, I don't think Melania would be crying her eyes out as she saw Donald soar into space. What else can I say before reading more material? I want to remind you that I'm speaking on Friday at 7 o'clock at the Working Men's Association Club in West Brom at 7 o'clock. That's in West Brom City Centre. If you're anywhere in the West Midlands, I think that's the place to be. It's going to be a terrific gathering, and it's me on Brexit, Britain, and the general election. And I'm on the 18th of January, Adam and me will be in Scotland, in East Kilbride, at the East Kilbride Village Theatre. Tickets are, by the way, more than a quarter sold, and there's 11 weeks to go. So that looks like it's going to be standing room only. So that's the 18th of January. Filza says, after today's poll, who do you predict will win the general election? We'll come to that in a minute. And my second question, Libya is chaotic. I know she's asked that one already. Libya chaotic, Iraq unstable, Syria and Afghanistan burning. What's common between all these countries? And Marie McFarlane says, Adam, will you please give us an update on President Duterte and what he came away with from the ASEAN summit? It is missing, it seems, from the mainstream media. Deal with that one first.
Yeah. Well, it was a successful summit, and ASEAN is always the organization that I think Europe could have been if it wasn't so inclined towards despotism. Overall, it's been a very good summit. It was hosted by Thailand, one of the founding members of the organization, and for the Philippines, it's really a matter of trying to do more trade and trying to get more foreign direct investment, both from within ASEAN, but more importantly, FDI coming into ASEAN and putting the Philippines on the map in that sense. The Philippines, interestingly, and this is one of the banes of Duterte's administration, because he has two hands and one foot tied behind his back by what is quite possibly the worst written constitution anywhere in the world today. It was one that was designed to replace one that left much to be desired, but it ended up making things worse. And so he is restricted from doing what he wants to do in terms of democratizing the economy, helping to diversify wealth outside of the capital, which is unaffectionately called Imperial Manila, and into the provinces, including Mindanao, where he comes from, the first modern Filipino leader from Mindanao. And so there's only so much Duterte can do in foreign affairs, though he's done a hell of a lot. He's probably been the most globally influential Filipino leader since Marcos, and a much more neutral one in terms of his relationships, strengthening ties with all of ASEAN, saying to Malaysia, that's for a long time had a territorial dispute over Sabah with the Philippines, let's do trade and put the dispute to one side, saying the same with China. Let's put these uninhabited islands in the South China Sea to one side, let's do trade. He's improved relations with India, with Russia, with Turkey, with multiple countries in the Middle East. And he's all done it while telling the European Union to go to places where Nigel Farage and Happier Days once told them to go. So it shows you, though, when you have a great leader but a horrible constitution, that you can only get so far.
Mike is in Stoke. He's got a question for Adam. Mike, go ahead. Mike, you're on the air. Mike, I can hear you coughing.
Oh, no, it's not me.
Who's this who's on the line?
Mike.
Mike, you've got the floor. What would you like to ask?
Okay. In recent years, we've never been able to have a vote on whether we approved of the war in Libya, in Iraq. We've never had it hasn't been at the right time. But now Johnson has been cozying up to Trump. I didn't like the way he was cozying up to him the other couple of months ago. If we elect Johnson, is he and Trump going to be riding around like the Sundance Kid, you know? What I'm saying is we've now got a chance to vote perhaps for somebody who's more anti-war, but at the same time, I'm a Brexiteer. So what do I do?
Aha. That's the $64,000 question, Adam.
It is.
Who should Mike vote for, in your view?
Well, before making that decision, and I couldn't presume to make it for anyone, one has to look at the facts on the ground. I love the way Mike phrased the question, because just think if Boris Johnson was cozying up to a President Barack Obama. Now, that would be something to worry about.
With Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State.
The woman, the butcher of Benghazi herself, yes. I think that the chances of the world going to war under a Trump presidency are vastly reduced compared to if Hillary had won, or if Biden were to possibly win, or any of the other possible competitors. And Johnson, too, weirdly enough, he doesn't really like war. When he was foreign secretary, and he clearly wasn't enjoying himself because May put him on a short lead. My, how the tables have turned, and aren't I, for one, really happy about that. May was awful, but I quite like Boris in many ways. Boris doesn't seem to be one for war. His Telegraph columns going back years show that...
Actually, his foreign policy in the Telegraph was much better than his foreign policy when he was in the Foreign Office.
Brilliantly put. That's absolutely right. And so Boris and Trump aren't all too different. I think it comes down to they're both bon vivants. They both love life. And weirdly, because of that, for them, politics is about fun. Where for someone like Blair, I honestly think Blair was mentally...
messianic.
Yes, there was something frightening about Blair. And then there's people like May who just do what she's told by the so-called deep state. But Trump and Johnson, I can't say that there won't be a war, but it's highly unlikely that the kind of disasters that we've seen will transpire under that partnership.
Highly likely that there won't be, as Theresa May might put it.
Yes.
Sorry, Mike, you'll need to clear out the way. Make way, order, order, clear the lobbies. There's a legend on the line, and it was her that was coughing. She's not called Fag Ash Flo for nothing. It's the legend that is Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, you're right, George. It's a red poppy.
Yes.
Now, today, at the beginning of the Everton-Tottenham football match, wreaths were laid by some forces, and the crowd felt silent. Now, maybe next Saturday's game should have been more appropriate. All I want to do is watch the football. On the 11th of November, and Remembrance Sunday at the Cenotaph, to my mind, is really the proper place. And all this whirring of poppies on TV for 2 weeks before I noticed that Adam Scott went on. It makes me a little bit cross.
Well, I don't know. I found the last post that was played today, the one that was played yesterday was a washout with very heavy rain. But the one that was played today I found quite moving. And
I switched the sound off. I didn't hear it.
I have absolutely no problem at all with people wearing poppies. There have been times when I have worn them myself, and I find the Remembrance Sunday extremely moving. I've stopped wearing poppies, as you can see, for the following reasons. The poppy and remembrance message has, I think, been hijacked by politicians who are forever cooking up new and more terrible wars to embroil us in. As they stand there at the cenotaph, their poppies ever larger, worn ever earlier in the calendar, waxen-faced with grief for the fallen who've fallen already, they are, I know, from personal knowledge, cooking up between their ears new wars that they can send new men to fall in. And I can't be a party to that. I give to the Royal British Legion in lieu, even though I have criticisms of the way the Royal British Legion spends its money. I give to Care After Combat, run by my friend Jim Davidson, in lieu, you might say, of buying and wearing a poppy per se. Adam.
Well, even though at a fundamental level, Norma and I are on a different side of things, I actually not only understand, but I empathise with where she's coming from. I think we've gotten to a stage in society where traditional values have been so debased and war has become a plaything for mediocre politicians rather than a proper decision entered into with the weight of conscience, that people are now clinging on to the poppy more than ever because other things are slipping away. And I share your disgust when looking at the Cheshire Cat face of Tony Blair with a poppy on his lapel, and my conscience is obviously clean because I would never support a war that I wouldn't be willing to fight in myself if physically able, which kind of explains why I haven't supported any war that I can think of just about in my lifetime. But I think we've got to remember that the symbol isn't about the people who are wearing it. The symbol is about the people who have fallen. When I wear the poppy, I wear it for the men in the trenches. I don't wear it for odious man like Tony Blair.
Last word to you, Norma.
Well, I agree with that, but you see, on my Facebook, my symbol is a red poppy, which was, I mean, it was terrible, all the blood that was, you know, people died, killed, whatever. But in the middle of my red poppy is a CND badge, and it doesn't take much to work that out.
Well, we can all creatively, as I did, and you have just outlined there, we can creatively find our ways to honour the fallen. And the best way to honour the fallen is to strive for a country which does not willy-nilly send more and more young men over and over again into senseless, pointless, unjustified and illegal war. It's been marvellous for me. Hope it was for you.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.